There it is.
Our first lesson comes from Isaiah chapter 60, the first 6 verses. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather together. They come to you. Your son shall come from far away, and your daughter shall be carried on their nurses' arms. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and rejoice, because the abundance of the sea shall be brought to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall proclaim the praise of the Lord.
Thank you, Priscilla, for that reading. We're going to go right into our gospel lesson, which is a familiar one. And it's the story that we've already heard alluded to this morning. It comes from Matthew chapter 2. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who's been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." Now, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea. For so it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is a shepherd of my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men, and he learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. And then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I may also go and pay him homage." And when they heard the king, they set out. And there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. And on entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. It's a pretty common story, isn't it? One we're familiar with and we hear read this time of year. The familiarity can, for us, breed a kind of disinterest, or at least an inability to hear them for all of the powerful truths and implications that they have. In fact, it seems rather fanciful, doesn't it? These kings appearing, coming with a caravan of camels. They appear at the doorstep of these young parents and an infant baby, kneeling down and presenting their gifts, a star that seems to wander about and somehow pinpoint exact household. It seems like an over-the-top embellishment to the nativity narrative. And yet there is a seriousness in this passage that cannot be escaped. And I just want to make a few observations about these Epiphany texts and the relevance that they have for our world, even today. And the first is this, that the good news, God's light, it shines out. And it's not a respecter of nations or cultural or religious, racial, or ethnic boundaries. You know, as the passage that Priscilla read, Isaiah says this, "Darkness shall cover the earth, and a thick darkness that will cover the people. But the Lord will rise on you, and his glory will appear over you." So the command is to rise and shine, for your light has come, For this reason, because nations will come to that light and kings to the brightness of the dawn. You know, both the psalm that we read in our call to worship and this passage from Isaiah, they talk about, make reference to the nation or kingdom of Sheba coming to Jerusalem to pay homage. You know, the kings of Tarshish and the Isles and the queens of Sheba. There's a great passage in 1 Kings chapter 10. Let me read to you just a few verses here, because it's quite a remarkable thing when the Queen of Sheba pays Solomon a visit. It says, when the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relationship with the Lord, she came to test Solomon with hard questions. Arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan with camels carrying spices, large quantities of gold and precious stones, she came to Solomon and she talked with him about all that she had on her mind. And Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. And when Queen Sheba saw all the wisdom that Solomon had, the palace that he built, the food on his table and the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes and his cupbearer and the burnt offerings that he made at the temple, she was overwhelmed. Queen of Sheba, she had a lot of what the world has to offer: wealth, position, authority. The tradition says that she was a really beautiful woman too. But she does not have a peace of mind. There are still questions, hard questions, that trouble her. And when she hears about Solomon's fame and, quote, his relationship with the Lord, she goes and she seeks answers, and she finds answers. There's a great text, Ethiopian text from the 14th century. It's called the Kabra Nagast, and it tells a story of the queen's visit to Solomon and their subsequent relationship and their offspring. Well, so what does that matter? What does it matter that kings are drawn? Well, it's simply this. It's one thing that is true, is that throughout all of God's covenants, there are indications that God uses certain individuals and families and people to become the means of conveying his blessings, and that those blessings are meant for everyone on earth. The story of the Queen of Sheba and of the wise men, those who are they were probably Zoroastrian priests, come from the East. There are colorful reminders that the light of God shines for all of those who have eyes to see and ears to hear and hearts to respond to it. Because God's enlightenment, God's blessing, doesn't know national or cultural or religious or racial boundaries. They're for all. You know, now more than ever, we are aware of the good gifts that we enjoy every day through the insight and the skill and the labor of other people all across this globe, people that we will never meet, people who don't speak our language, they may not look like us, probably don't share our customs, but everywhere we go for the things that we rely on daily, whether that's to the grocery store, to shop, or to the auto dealership, or to a medical center, or to the wireless phone store, wherever we turn, we enjoy comforts and convenience and consumer goods that are the fruits of other people who have used their God-given insights and abilities to advance and to understand and cultivate food and to create things that make our life healthier and safer and fuller. It's God's light that leads to insight everywhere. And yet, beyond just that, there is more. Just like the Queen of Sheba had all that one could have wanted in her day, still there was more, some hard questions. And we see that the folks who respond to the true light, the full light, it's an enlightenment that leads to an investigation, a quest for the source of light, and it results in piety, bringing tribute to God, paying homage to the Christ child. You know, even in our world, there are those who don't know Christ as the true light, and yet, nonetheless, they are God-fearers. They seek to do good. They respect their neighbors. They exercise wide stewardship of the natural world. Now, that's not true of everyone by any means, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But this has a couple implications for us. And one is that watch for these brothers and sisters who do fear God, embrace them, and share with them the fuller news of who the true light of life is. Don't hesitate to share the light of Christ with them, because this world is hungry for answers that make sense out of the world. Just like the Queen of Sheba, they have hard questions. I'll bet right now, within walking distance from where you're seated, are neighbors, maybe strangers, maybe friends, who are anxious about things that they don't understand. They have questions about suffering and hardship, questions about, is there really any truth in the world? And what's the foundation for justice? And how do we pursue it? What's the point of human existence anywhere? Where does it all lead? What's the wherefore and the why? Well, it's an opportunity to share with them the light of Christ, a story that makes sense of this world that we live in. Now, the second thing that this passage reminds us is that the world we live in needs the light. You know, the passage doesn't shy away from the fact that evil is very real in this world. It is a world in which political power is exercised in the cause of self-interest and greed often. It's not a fairy tale world that God comes in the person of Jesus, but it's this one. It's this world, this material world, this world of real politic. And that's why Christ's incarnation really matters. His in-fleshness means that Jesus comes to the real world, the real material world, to resolve real material world problems. You know, I'll admit that sometimes we can harbor an embarrassment about the gospel. You know, maybe this notion that's commonly held among folks who are well educated, that the Bible is really just a collection of myths that give people comfort in the face of an uncaring or indifferent world. There are those who argue that the message of Jesus is kind of like a bedtime story, and it's nothing more. It's privately meaningful, maybe, but it doesn't have much to offer the real world of power and politics. That is so suggests the enlightened ones who have outgrown childhood fantasies and children's stories. You know, but nothing could be further from the truth. Matthew is at pains to ensure us that it is in this world, with its tensions and violence and political struggles, that Jesus comes. He starts his whole gospel with a 42-generation genealogy of Jesus to make the point over and over again. It's this place with these people, with this family heritage, that Jesus is born. Matthew and Luke talk about King Herod. Luke goes in, he adds other political details, telling us that Caesar Augustus, during this time, had issued a decree, a census, to be taken of the whole Roman world. We're told that that also happens during the time that Quirinius was a governor of Syria. These are real historic politicians, folks with power. Augustus was exercising his control over the empire by counting up all the subjects and citizens and slaves in an effort to better control them. And it is into this world that Jesus comes. You know, Herod, we know, he was a particularly ruthless man. He was attracted to power, and he was paranoid about holding on to that power. He'd made an idol out of power, thinking that would secure for him a future that he wanted. And Herod, like everyone who makes an idol out of power, had a habit of deceit, of lying, of misrepresentation of the facts. And we see in this morning's passage, he dishonestly manipulates the Magi, suggesting that he wants to honor Christ too. And just like everyone who makes an idol out of power, he agitates and disrupts the peace of others around him. Did you notice? I like the way that passage puts this. It says, King Herod was disturbed after the Magi come to him, and all of Jerusalem with him. He foments a kind of irritation and upset. And just like all men of power, he resorts to violence when he feels threatened. If I'd read further in Matthew's, the second chapter of Matthew's gospel, you know this story. Herod becomes so furious when the Magi didn't do what he asked them to do, that he sends out death squads to go kill all male babies under the age of 2 to Jerusalem. It's known as the slaughtering of the innocents. Herod made manipulative use of others to advance his own personal gain. And when they became inconvenient, he dropped them. You know, we have more historical records about King Herod than we do about Julius Caesar or Caesar Augustus or almost anybody else in first century Palestine there. And that's due mostly to the writing of Josephus. He was a first century Jewish historian. There's a historian out at Western Michigan University, Paul Mayer. He summarizes what Josephus tells us about Herod this way. Let me read this to you. He says, Herod actually put to death 3 of his own sons on suspicion of treason. He put to death his favorite wife, Marian, and she was a Maccabean princess rather. He put her to death, and then he killed his mother-in-law. He invited the high priest to come down to Jericho for a swim, and then they played a really rough game of water polo and drowned him. He killed several uncles and some of his cousins. Herod was a bad guy. His self-interest led him to the habit of deceit, which then led to manipulation of other people, and ultimately to violence, leading to death. And he did it not to buy him, he did it in a way to secure a future that he thought if he could hold on to power, he would get what he wanted. But like everybody who worships any idol, it ends in foolishness and frustration. And despite all of his best efforts, just like the rest of us, he died. You know, it's no coincidence that people that renounce the revelation of Christ, just like King Herod, sought to suppress it, sought to kill the baby before he can even grow up. That those ones who try to suppress the truth of Christ and oppress Christians and outlaw Christian practices, or people that develop an official policy of atheism and try to impress that upon others, they are also the authors of history's greatest atrocities and systematic murder. They are responsible for an ocean of human suffering and misery. You know, a number of years ago, Christopher Hitchin, who was a pretty insightful guy, a bright man, very bright man, articulate, he wrote a book called God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. He's got some interesting observations, but it's not particularly original or insightful, or in some ways it's not even a very honest book. Because when we look through history, what we see is that the most atrocious acts against humanity have not been carried out under the banner of religion, certainly not under the banner of Christ, but the opposite. It's the embrace of atheism, especially as a state policy, and the cause of imposing godlessness that has resulted in the greatest violence, the greatest slaughter of innocents and crimes against humanity. This Herod's own act of slaughtering the innocent, that's been repeated over and over again through human history. Think of Hitler's war, his anti-Christian Nietzschean plan that resulted in the death of up to 53 million people because of World War II and its aftermath. Or Stalin's Soviet Union, or Mussolini's Italy, or Chairman Mao's China, or Ho Chi Minh's of Vietnam, or Pol Pot's Cambodia, or more recently, Augusto Pinochet's Chile, or Ceausescu's Romania, or Milosevic, Yugoslavia, and Serbia, and of course, 3 generations of Kims in power in North Korea? How many hundreds of millions have suffered and died as a direct result of policies that are built on an explicit or implicit denial of God, a repression of God's revelation in Christ, a desire to ignore the moral fabric of this world and use people just as props in some personal, immature play, self-centered people or groups who want to hold onto power. It's way too many. Some people or some historians have convincingly argued that it was actually Christianity, the revelation in Christ, that has provided the philosophical and ethical basis for some of humanity's greatest political advancements. This notion and ideas like the dignity of every human person, or the universal human rights, or that justice and truth are actually anchored in the transcendent, benevolent God, rather than just empty concepts to be employed or discarded as they serve the interests of power. See, the gospel of Jesus comes into this world as it is, to confront it and interrupt it, and to supplant the way of self-interested power with another way of self-sacrifice, of hope, of service. And that news today is as relevant as it has ever been to the world. But I want to read something from Solzhenitsyn, though, just as a reminder, just in case thinking about these despicable actions of other people can make us feel kind of smug at not having become murdering dictators ourselves. Let me remind you, Solzhenitsyn said this, and he himself was a victim of Stalin's, where he spent 8 years in hard labor in a Soviet work camp. He was exiled and oppressed. His writings were suppressed. But Solzhenitsyn reminds us of this, that the line that separates good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. We can and we should engage in impassioned political debates about laws and policies and political practices that should lead to the greatest good for our shared life together in our cities and our states and our countries. Differences of perspective and healthy debates, how we sharpen our ideas, how we correct our path, how we move forward and improve the world that we live in, and leave it a better place for our children. However, whenever and wherever we see a deliberate effort to actively deceive and manipulate others for the sake of personal gain or simply to maintain and exercise power, whether we see that in ourselves or in others, we should confront it, call it out, shine a light on it, not to be overcome by it, by imitating its own means and methods, but by rather smothering it with the good. And that's my final point for today. That despite the incredible power that evil has to do harm in the world, it has not, and it cannot overpower the good. Or as John 1 puts it this way, speaking about the arrival of Christ into this world, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness can't overcome it. The darkness didn't overcome it. The Greek word here that's translated as overcome is sometimes translated comprehended. The darkness could not comprehend it. Part of that is we think it cognitively, lay hold of, but it means the darkness can't circumscribe or extinguish it. It can't own it or control it or snuff out this light. The light keeps moving forward in our lives and in the world at large. In fact, despite concentrated and concerted efforts to squash out the truth of life, of the truth of Christ, his good news keeps taking hold. There are more Christians alive now than ever. Do you know that China is, if not already, will quite soon be the nation with the largest concentration of Christians on the planet? And this in a country with an official policy of atheism. And despite decades of atheistic communism in the former Soviet Union, it's estimated now that only about 4% of those citizens are avowed atheists, and about half or more are professing Christians. This comes after multiple attempts to suppress the truth. This good news that we have in Jesus is not a thing that we can afford to turn just into a fairy tale or a nice children's story or something that we enact with bathrobes and shepherds on Christmas Eve. No, this is a powerful story that leads to flourishing and life and hope and meaning and purpose in this world that needs it, even when people are bent on denying the truthfulness of it. Let me tell you, I'll end with this little story about the power of light, even in the face of personal and institutional efforts to keep it extinguished. It's a story about Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty and SS Colonel Herbert Capper, both of Italy. I read about their story and interaction in a little book by Jeremiah Johnston, came out in 2017, called Unimaginable: What the World Would Be Like Without Christianity. Well, Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty was an Italian priest, and he served as a kind of a diplomatic function in the Vatican during the war years from 43 to 45. And while in that office, he set up this underground network, and they would hide and smuggle to safety over in Switzerland all type of folks, Allied pilots that had been shot down, members of the Italian resistance, military escapees, and of course, Jewish families and individuals that were on the run. Well, in Rome, the chief of police was SS Colonel Herbert Kapler. And he suspected that the Monsignor was up to something. He knew that there was this underground ring happening, but he couldn't prove it. So he threatened the priest. He even tried to have him assassinated. But before he could do that, the Allied troops arrived and liberated the country. And as the American and British armies grew near, Kapler sought out Father O'Flaherty, and he begged him for help. He said, "I know you can help me avoid what's coming to me, imprisonment or worse." And initially, Monsignor O'Flaherty was angry. He refused to help him. He said, after all, because of Kepler's own actions, at least 2,300 innocent people had been put to death. And tearfully, Kepler pleaded for the life of his family and his own life. And he applied to convictions and truths that his whole life to that point had been bent against. He said this: "Is there no God? Is there no humanity?" And with those questions, he begged for mercy. Well, quite shortly after that, Kepler was in the custody of the British Army. And while he was held in prison, he learned that his one-time enemy, Father O'Flaherty, had intervened on Kepler's family's behalf. He'd smuggled them safely out of Italy into Switzerland. And at the War Crimes Tribunal in Italy, Kepler was sentenced to life in prison. He was placed in the Ghetto military prison. His wife divorced him, his family disowned him. They never went to visit him in prison. But one person did visit him regularly. You guessed it, Monsignor O'Flaherty. Through their visits and conversation, Kepler repented of the untruths that he had wrapped up and held so tightly in his heart. He repented of his own arrogance and pride. He turned around, repented, responding to Christ's invitation. He gave up his atheism, his Nazi beliefs. He put his faith in Christ. You know, the two questions that he had asked Kepler, is there no God? Is there no humanity? They were probably stated rhetorically at the moment, because in that moment it was undeniable to him that of course there is a God who demands justice and truth and love. And it's because of that, God, that there is humanity, that we are who are his children can imitate God in our quest to understand truth and enact justice and to relate to each other out of love. Each life is valuable, deserves dignity and respect and freedom. And Kepler knew that crystal clear in those final moments of his desperation. For the truth is this, that despite the efforts to deny the truth, the light still shines and the darkness does not overcome it. And this world that we live in needs a good news of God in the flesh, God in this world with us more now than ever. So friends, let me challenge you even this week. Let us rejoice in that as the prophet demands. Rejoice, your light has shone on you. Arise, and let the light shine off of us, bounce off of us, that it can be a blessing to other folks. May that be true for us. We're going to close with a final hymn of blessing. Jody has put together for us.
The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen. 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 The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen. 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 May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family and your children and their children and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family and your children and their children and their children. May his presence go before you and behind you and beside you, all around you and within you. He is with you, he is with you in the morning, in the evening, in your coming and your going, in your weeping and rejoicing. He is for you, 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 he is for you. gracious to you. The Lord turn his face